welcome to episode 14 of FranFunnel Live. Really want to come up with a little bit more of a fun topic today. We're going to talk a little bit about emoji. You've probably sent and received them quite a bit. If you're under the age of 60, if you're over the age of 60, you maybe have received one or two, maybe you've elected to send them before. But rather than tackling kind of what emoji mean and why people use them, I brought our CTO, Kevin, along today because I want to talk about technically how emoji actually work, like what's going on behind the scenes when we elect to send an emoji. So Kevin, I'm going to start very briefly, very simply, from a technical component or from technical view. What is an emoji? Like what does it actually, whatever caption?
Emojis are just like any other letter,
Okay.
But they have a long and complicated history.
Okay.
And so I think in order to get there, I think we need to first start talking about how text is actually stored on a computer at all.
Let's do it.
So as you probably know, everything on a computer is ultimately going to end up being stored as ones and zeros.
Right.
A string of ones and zeros, which is kind of hard to read, as you might imagine.
Of course.
And so we have to come up with a system for encoding something like the English language into these ones and zeros.
Okay.
And so traditionally, in the beginning, when each one of these ones and zeros was very expensive, we would use a relatively limited set of characters.
Okay.
And so the most common way that this was done was to group those ones and zeros into eights.
Okay.
And so each one and zero by itself is called a bit.
All right.
And when you have 8 of them together, it's called a byte.
Okay.
So you may have heard the term megabyte, whatever. That means 1,000,000 bytes, which is 8 million bits.
I'm following so far.
Okay, great. So what we did was we basically took all possible 8-digit strings of ones and zeros, all possible bytes, which, if you're doing the math, is 256 different possible numbers.
Obviously.
And we coded those up to say, okay, 1 maps with this letter, 2 maps with this letter, 3 maps with this symbol, whatever.
Okay.
And so if you're doing the math in your head already, we've got, okay, so there's 26 letters, uppercase and lowercase, that's 52. We got 0 through 9. That is, 62 at this point?
Sure.
We got a lot more. There's all these extra symbols that you can use, like the shift 8, all that kind of stuff.
Know it.
That's all important. And then there's also a bunch of control characters.
Okay.
So probably about half of these characters you're never going to see. They just do different things on different systems.
Interesting.
Like, for example, when these all were being printed on teletype machines, which were just basically typewriters that were hooked up to an electronic feed, you would have a specific character that said, okay, go to the next line, the line return.
Gotcha.
And you have different versions of that as well. So you might have go to the next line, but stay at the same place, go to the next line, go to the beginning, all of that. This all gets encoded into one of these 8-digit bits.
And this was a long time ago.
This was all the way back when they first started building computers. This is what it looked like.
Cool.
It actually predates computers. It comes from teletype machines.
Okay.
So like Telegraph and all that, Western Union, Edison, all those guys. So now we've got a problem, okay? Because we've used up all 256 of these possible characters.
Okay.
And then we realized that we've got to represent Russian, Cyrillic.
Wow.
We realized that we want to represent all kinds of other things.
Okay.
And so there's this new challenge, which is how do you represent all the different things which you would want to represent like text? It's going to include other languages, it's going to include other control characters, and most importantly to our discussion, it's going to include emojis.
Okay.
So a lot of waffling through the 90s and 2000s, a lot of different standards coming about. Microsoft really liked the Latin 1 standard, other people use different standards, and you get to this world where everything's very complicated because now when you receive text, you not only need to know what data is in the text, but you need to know how the text is encoded.
Interesting. Okay, so it wasn't just what the eye was seeing, it's saying different tech providers were saying when the eye sees this, I'm actually going to, at the very basic level of computing, change this into something fundamentally different.
Right.
Interesting, okay.
And so a lot of them stemmed out of ASCII, which is the normal system that I was describing earlier, the 256 thing. But then they would have special control characters that would say, okay, if you see this control character, I'm going to use the next 2 bytes to describe something more complicated.
Okay.
And as computers became cheaper, as storage became cheaper, as memory became cheaper, as processing became cheaper, the ability to use more bytes per letter just became more reasonable.
Gotcha.
And so some standards boards came together and they created what was called the Unicode standard.
Okay.
And the Unicode standard is a much larger set of mappings from numbers to characters.
Gotcha.
And we're nowhere near capacity on this. It was decided that this is not going to be a system for encoding, but it's going to be a system for mapping these numeric code points to the symbols they represent.
Interesting.
And there's so much room here. We could now represent anything that's symbolically that we could even think of.
Okay, so just so we're on the journey here, so it's like we had this 256 world, and then in the early 2000s, it sounds like, people came together and said, well, 256 wasn't even near, we need infinity, or like for all intents and purposes, we need more and more and more. So now the room has been created.
Yes.
So then where do emoji kind of come in now in this world where there's new room?
So there's a simultaneous stream of development going on here, which is phones.
Okay.
So people are now chatting with each other on their phones, and they're sending each other emoticons. They're also doing this on bulletin boards. They've been doing ASCII art for a while. They're doing it in email. But they're basically trying to communicate some kind of an emotion through the use of standard existing symbols on their keyboard.
Right.
So you might remember like the 8 close paren being like a super happy face, that kind of thing.
Sure.
And so people were doing this, and phones were starting to notice people doing this. So you would see like on the early iPhones, for example, when you typed a lot of these characters, it would transform them into a picture.
Ah, okay.
And so it would take this image that you created using text and transform it into a picture of a smiling face in yellow was the traditional.
So just at the device level, it's saying every time I see colon, close parentheses, I want to now display happy face because I think that's what people are trying to do. Okay.
And so a lot of different pieces of software were doing this. You're seeing it on phones, you were seeing it on like chat programs, email, all kinds of things like that. And people started to realize that there was opportunity within the giant space of Unicode to start encoding some of these things to be a little bit more precise about what each one means.
Gotcha.
And so each year, the Unicode standards body evaluates the addition of new symbols.
Wow.
And there started to be more and more applications for symbols that involved emojis, representations of emotion or pictograms as a sort of a new way to communicate.
So now instead of letting the devices just decide when these already existing characters come together, you're actually saying, no, I'm going to send a bigger packet of information, and this bigger packet of information actually corresponds to something much more complicated. There's colors, there's all sorts of things that are going to be involved.
There's all kinds of control characters that you can use to indicate skin tone, things like that. And there's a new set of code points which represent all of these different things that ultimately go into the pictorial image that you're going to see represented as that single character.
Gotcha.
Emoji.
So 2 questions I want to ask on the back of this, and as you can tell, we could probably sit here talking about the tech behind emoji for a long time. So the first one is, one of the things I'm always interested in emoji is if there's an emoji on my phone, so if I choose to send that, and then we either look at your phone or a computer or a different browser, the actual visual representation of what was on my phone versus where it's displayed is different. So what's actually going on there?
Okay, so what you're looking at in the Unicode specification is more particularly not an image itself, but rather a description of an image.
Ah, okay.
And so just like fonts will represent the pictorial concept of A slightly differently, each device is going to have its own fonts. And actually a font itself may define its own emoji code points.
Interesting.
So I may create a font that does the smiley face a little bit differently than your font, but most fonts tend not to have these.
Interesting.
So what generally happens is that your system, whatever you're using, whether it's your iPhone or your Android or whatever, says, okay, if my font doesn't have a representation for this code point, I'm going to go to my library. And my library contains the things that are drawn in the style that I like to see. But what's being sent between everybody is just those code points. It's just a number.
Interesting. So there really is no standard smiley face, right? So it's like we're kind of still in the wild, wild west in that each device that you're using to visually represent the emoji gets to be opinionated when they get this Unicode character to say, this is how I want to represent it.
Yeah, but the same has always been true for letters as well with fonts. Like, it's basically just, it would be too much of a burden on font designers to expect them to cover all of the emojis.
Sure.
So they tend not to.
Interesting. And last question I have, so you mentioned this idea of getting new emojis. So as we talked about this before, new emoji are added to the world at a fairly, so if I wanted to get a new emoji, if I wanted to create one and get it kind of installed into the Unicode official world that this exists, is that an easy process to do? Am I going to have to pay some people off?
Can't imagine it is.
Okay.
I'm not intimately familiar with what regulatory body exists to do that. However, it's broadly encompassed in a standards organization which maintains the Unicode standard.
Gotcha.
And so each year we generally see a release of new standards to that.
Sure.
New standard code points. And so I'm not going to go into exactly what application process you got to go through, but there is a sense that Apple has some sway there.
Of course. And it's interesting, depending on what kind of device you have, sometimes if someone tries to send you an emoji, you'll see kind of like a box with an X through it sometimes, which would be that perhaps your device doesn't recognize the Unicode that came through. Maybe it's something new or experimental or whatever it may be. I mean, it happens, right?
Each year when these new standards get updated, your device may not have those images drawn yet. Maybe you didn't run the update that has those. Generally, though, phones try to keep up with them, and so I think that everybody kind of has a sense of, like, between rumors and everything, what standards are going to be adopted in a given year, and so they try to get ahead of it.
Interesting.
So by the time that your phone is capable of actually sending new emojis, it's usually also capable of reading those.
Of course, of course. As usual, with the vast majority of things we do around here, especially from a marketing angle, the technical components behind them are endlessly complicated. Here I am just, putting a picture of a bird in my text message, and lo and behold, there's, 100 years of history going back to, I believe the word telegraph was dropped in this particular FranFunnel Live for why it looks like that. I think that from a marketing perspective, we just think about the use of emoji. I think you're interested in saying that we're just scratching the surface on what does it mean for symbols to be more complicated than just colons and parentheses and letters, right? Why is it that you can't have your own emoji, right? As Kevin said, one would imagine that we're going to get to a point where these symbols can be translated by everybody, right? But I do like the point that the device manufacturers and the people actually writing the codes are probably going to have a little bit of sway in saying how it's done. Absolutely. Well, this has been a fantastic episode 14. Any questions about emoji, you know where to find us. If you'd like to just send us an emoji, feel free to do that too. We really enjoy it. And Kevin, thanks for stopping by.
Yeah, sound off in the comments with your favorite emoji.
Talk to you soon.